Hello everybody! Welcome back for another installment of Becoming a Unity 3D Badass. I'm Michael Conaway. I'll be your host. We're going to be going through a few new things today about Unity 3D. We're going to get a little bit more into game object editing, explaining what components are and how they work, and talking about just working with assets in Unity 3D. Alright, so the first thing we're going to have to talk about is creating game objects. I showed that briefly in the last video, that you can either come up here to the Game Objects tab to be able to create game objects, or you can get in the hierarchy here. You can also do this in the project view by coming down and right-clicking and going to the Create option in the context menu that pops up there, and then you can choose from a selection of objects that you can want to create, materials, lens flares, etc. You can see everything in the list here, and including C# scripts, which we will be getting into soon on actually creating your own functionality in Unity. So let's take a look at some of this. Let's say that we needed to create a ground plane, for example, just a flat plane that we wanted to use as our ground for some reason. We can do that by creating a quad, for example, which is just a quad is made out of two triangles. You can see these triangles here, and all meshes. Everything that you see rendered in a game is actually built out of triangles in a 3D package, usually. In this case, this is generated by Unity 3D for us. We can use that to make a ground plane. It obviously is not rotated the right way, so we'd come up to the inspector here if we wanted to specifically enter values that we want. We can just put that to 90. And that's going to rotate it 90 degrees around the x-axis, which puts it down flat for us, and then we can come up here and mess around with the scale. And I usually do the z value as well, even though it's not really necessary on this one. So once something like that is done, you might be saying, well, it's white. It's very white, and it doesn't look much like the ground plane. Now, later on, we would actually go ahead and create texture, or download a texture off the internet to use in a material, but we're not going to worry about that for now. But one thing we do want to do is create a material that we want to put on here to be able to color it differently. And I'm just going to give you a brief intro to editing a game object a little bit and creating an asset. So the first thing I want to explain about the project view is that project organization is very important, and getting good habits with it right from the beginning will help you out immensely. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a folder down here that's named 0 assets. And the reason I put a leading 0 on there in the dash just to separate that, I put a 0 on there is because that's going to always keep it at the top of the list here. And you'll see me in later videos create other folders which, just follow that sequence, that pattern, 0, 1, 2, 3, it's in the title. So we've got assets, and then I'm going to create another folder inside of that called materials. And then in there, I'm going to go ahead and create one more called environment, because now we have a nice organized structure for these. We can say, oh, I want a material, so we know those are in our assets folder. We're going to find our materials folder, and then we can find out within categories, within subfolders, well, what do we have available. So now we want to create a material. To do that, we can go down here, say create material, click that. Let's call it ground, and we're going to change the color on that guy. We're just going to stick with the standard shader for now. There's a lot of different shader options. One thing about materials is the way that a material works is it's kind of like a paintbrush. A material has a lot of properties in it that say, if I put this material on an object, such as this quad that we've created in the scene view, we want it to be rendered based on the properties defined in the material. So a shader is the primary, the biggest, most important property of a material as far as getting a look you want, and there's all kinds of different shaders. We can go over some of those in the later videos. Standard is the latest type of shader that they allow, but there's a lot of different options in here. Let's see. I'm probably just going to go with the standard one, but you could go with something like unlit, which means there's no lighting calculations being applied to it, but we're not going to do that. We'll just leave it on standard for now. And we're just going to make this, let's go with some green. Some green, like it was some grass or something in there. Now when it comes time to apply a material, you can do one of two things. It depends on just the setup of the object that we're dealing with. You can see here, if we select our quad, either by clicking on it here or up here, we can see that the mesh renderer that is on an object that is being rendered, like this, has a materials slot there, and you can put multiple materials in that area, which we can go into later on, but usually you're just going to have one in most cases. Just have one material. And there's some other options here, which we can get into another time, but right now let's just talk about the material. So you can either apply a material to a game object by dragging in and dropping here, or just dropping directly onto it. You can see it actually changes temporarily if we hover it. It changes both in the inspector here, showing that that's what's going to happen, and you see it applied directly as a preview. So let's just go ahead and drop that onto it. Now we can see we can get in here, we can edit this, which actually does change the material, because it is this here is pointing right at the asset. So if you want, multiple objects, ground objects for some reason, different colors on them or different textures, which is another thing that happens in the material, is we actually will apply textures, which are two-dimensional images that get projected onto the object. Again, a lot of stuff that I'd like to explain in more depth later on, but you can also apply textures here. So right now we just want to get a nice green ground plane. Alright, so there you go. So that's demonstrating how you can, how the inspector, so far what we've demonstrated is how the inspector is going to show all the properties of the whatever it is you're editing. Creating assets can be done in your project view. Can be done by creating you can create folders for structure, and then you're able to right click and create assets. In whatever the current directory that you're in, you can create those by right clicking, going to your create menu, and then finding the asset that you want to create and doing that. So let's see, another thing you can do, you can see up here in the inspector, every object is named, and if you want to change the name of a game object, you can go up in there, you can select this, and you can change it to my ground, or whatever you're going to name it, and hit enter to confirm that, or you can double click, it's kind of a slow double click, and you can rename directly in the hierarchy. So that's two ways that you can do that. So I'm wanting to get a little bit more into components here. Components, there's a whole ton of components available, and it's not helping any. So if you have the search bar empty, you can see the full selection of components available to us to be able to apply, add on to game objects. And so far you can see we already have a few components on here. We have a shader, which is it's shown here, but it's a part of the mesh renderer. We have a mesh collider, which is used for physics and keeping things from passing through one another. Mesh filter, which I don't think I've mentioned before. Mesh filter is used by a renderer, mesh renderer, or a skin mesh renderer, which you've learned about at some point here. It's used by whatever mesh renderer is on there as the thing to render. So this is a mesh quad, and it's what the mesh renderer is looking at for data to use to render something out into the world. The transform component is basically the spatial logic or data for a game object. Its scale, rotation, and position is contained within the transform component. Layers are used both for controlling what is rendered by what camera, and also in collision detection, physics, those types of things. And there's some other advanced things you can do with that. Tags are basically to help you in any, either in the logic of your scripts or just in organizing things. There's a few different things you can use tags for. This check mark here controls whether a game object is enabled or disabled. You can see some components have check marks too, and that basically does the same thing, but only for the component that you're looking at, whichever component that checkbox is in there. Static is, that's an option that allows you to set whether the object is going to stay exactly where it is all the time or not, and that allows Unity to perform some optimizations that are helpful. And then some settings that are associated with that, and we'll go into those types of things in more detail here at some point. So I think that pretty much covers everything I want to go over for the moment, all the basics of creating assets, creating game objects. Actually, no, that's not true. So let's go ahead and create another primary folder real quick. We're going to dive into another subject briefly, which is prefabs. Prefabs are a very important aspect of Unity3D. They're basically like blueprints. So if you've created a game object like this ground plane, and you know that you're going to need to use it for other things. You're going to need to create a lot of copies of it at runtime. You know, you can imagine in a video game you've ever seen, there's a lot of enemies, but they're all duplicates, usually, of ones that you've seen previously. Well, you would have a prefab of your enemy, and then you would do what's called instantiating that many times in order to get the many instances of them in the world that you have. So you'd have only one blueprint for that bad guy, but then you're going to print copies of it out into the world and let them do their thing. So we've created the prefabs folder. Let's create a subfolder here for environment, like to give ourselves some categories like we talked about for organization. And then we're going to just come up here, and let's say we wanted to make a blueprint out of this game object. We want to be able to use this later. We want to, we want to save this as an asset to use in many places rather than simply as a part of the scene. So what we can do is we can simply grab an object in the hierarchy and drag it right down into there and drop it. And suddenly we see we have this ground object here. And that is it's been copied in and turned into an actual asset in the project view, which means it's actually on the disk. See, you can see if we go to that same folder on the hard drive, it's actually a file on the hard drive now. So that's the primary one big difference between game objects and things that are in the project view and ones that are in the hierarchy. If you wanted to make a copy of this out into the world without scripting it, what you can do is just drag that right out. Let's see if we can. You can drag that right out and drop it, and you end up with copies, exact duplicates. And one other cool thing, which I'll show you here, is these are all linked to this prefab still. All of them are linked to it. So if I was to go to this one, and you can see now here we have a little bit different options up here than we used to for prefabs right here. And so let's say, for example, we come in here and we're messing around with the color. Now you notice that every one of these, that's the one thing here with materials specifically, this isn't really representing prefab functionality. This is because they're all pointing at the same material. But let's say, for example, that we've changed that. Oh, that doesn't work that way with materials. Oh, no, I'm going to look like an idiot. Okay, so change that up a little bit. Let's say we want to change the mesh collider here, right? So we're just going to change a property on the mesh collider. To demonstrate the way prefabs work with their linking is that first and foremost, we can revert this, and it's going to put us back to whatever properties the original prefab down here has. Now, if we go to another one of these right now, click on this one, for example, you can see that the mesh collider doesn't have that set. And you say, well, they're linked. Why aren't they all copying the same values? Well, these, right, as soon as they go into the world, and they aren't just as soon as a prefab's dragged out into the world and a copy is made, they're called prefab instances or game object instances. And that means, while yes, they point at the prefab, they can have their own individual properties. Now, if I was to come in here and I was to, well, let's say, scale this up on the x-axis to about 100, 150. Fix that or it's going to drive people nuts. We could revert it and just drop it back down. That's one way that lets you keep things, synced up to whatever the properties in the prefab are, or we can apply it. And you see instantly that all the other linked objects in the scene, all the other objects linked to that ground plane then take up the same properties that we've applied to the prefab. This game object's settings, all of its properties, if I click apply, get applied to the prefab, and because everything else is linked, they take up those changes. So just like that. So that's a little intro on how prefabs work. We'll get into more about why they're necessary, why they help later on in tutorials which have a little bit more context to them, a little bit more substance on an exercise that we're actually executing on at that time. But for now, I think that's going to wrap it up on the basic intro of game objects and components and assets and working with them in Unity3D. Thank you much for coming by and checking us out. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon.